we are focused, as you folks know, on Hong Kong. What now, what's going on today, and what might be coming. This is our focus for this evening. The events there have gained global attention, as well they should. Hong Kong is, of course, one of the world's most important cities, one of the most dynamic cities. It's a global financial hub. It's a global shipping hub. It's a very important city, and it's a city with this long history in the consciousness of people from other places. Everybody has heard of Hong Kong. So these massive protests that have taken place this year have drawn our attention. But our attention was already on Hong Kong, in part because of the protests that preceded the recent several months of demonstrations. The protest in 2003, opposition to a national security law being put forward by the Hong Kong government. The demonstrations that we now call the Umbrella Movement in 2014 in opposition to a central government decision on how the chief executive of Hong Kong would be chosen. So there's precedent. And each one of these protests seems to be getting larger in size. And so when we look at 2019, our speakers today are going to take you through some of the timeline, and they'll show the evolution of opinion over the last several months. But I'd like to draw your attention, for those of you who may be new to the topic, that the demonstrations that began in June and accelerated in July and have continued up through yesterday, those demonstrations, of course, were the initial trigger was an extradition bill that was put forward by the Hong Kong government to try to come up with a standardized way to handle people who were accused of crimes on the Chinese mainland or in Macau or in Taiwan, to have a system by which those jurisdictions could request that the Hong Kong government send those individuals for trial in those jurisdictions. And there was opposition when this was put forward, first in February and then formally put before the government, the Legislative Council, in April. The opposition came from all quarters. Business groups and foreign business associations raised complaints. And the government responded to some of those complaints and revised the bill at the end of May. But that was not enough. And so beginning in June, you have massive demonstrations. And you'll see, and our speakers will emphasize, the role of young people in initiating, leading, providing the real energy behind these demonstrations. What we saw in June was what? We also saw pushback. We saw violence. We saw the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and we started to see much more confrontational tactics. At that point, the chief executive, Carrie Lam, said, "We will suspend the bill." That wasn't enough. Protests continued, violent clashes broke out. Later in July, you had unprecedented protests continue. And the chief executive said, the bill is dead, but didn't actually withdraw the bill. That didn't happen until 2 weeks ago. And as the demonstrations proceeded, we see that the demands on the part of the demonstrators expanded. What initially they were pushing for, just the withdrawal of the bill, they came to ask for other things. And that will be discussed by our presenters. Some wanted the chief executive to resign. Some wanted the protests in June to be reclassified not as riots, but as demonstrations. Labeling them riots suggested something different about the participants. They wanted redress. And what? They wanted an investigation, an independent investigation of police tactics, police practices. They didn't want the government to handle this. They wanted outsiders to handle this, perhaps headed by a judge, something like that. And they returned to the call for direct say in who governs Hong Kong. A demand for universal suffrage and being able to choose not from a predetermined list. So these demands have expanded. What's driving these protests? We have several folks who have detailed answers to those questions. They have done surveys among the people in the demonstrations, people observing the demonstrations, and even people opposing the demonstrations. So you're going to get a real deep dive into motivations, in looking at what has brought people on such a huge scale into the streets. Of course, we've been looking at questions of identity. Cantonese speaking, people who define themselves as Hong Kongers first, not Chinese. So identity questions have come up. Also, the question of accountability and transparency. And Hong Kong, of course, is not the only place where these issues come up. Who is going to be accountable for police brutality? Who will judge? Who will investigate? And the question of rule of law. And you're going to see you'll hear presentations that are going to emphasize the role of rule of law in what has made Hong Kong special in Asia and now as part of the People's Republic of China. And we'll hear discussions about the rule of law in this moment and see examples of that. I want to emphasize the role of young people. Many of those demonstrating were not alive at the time in 1997 when Hong Kong was returned to the control of Beijing. They postdate that. Their consciousness is different. This is the best educated generation ever. They have expectations. They know how to express themselves. They are very skilled users of media, managing the images put forward, managing the narrative. And so there's a lot for us to talk about. We have people with backgrounds in journalism, people who have been business analysts. We have people who have been management consultants. We have folks who are the leading lights in polling. We have distinguished scholars of media and society with us today. And we have you. First, we're going to bring you 5 presentations. 2 of the presentations will come from people here in Los Angeles. 3 of the presentations will come to you from Hong Kong. After those presentations, we're going to have a discussion, a Q&A with all 5 of our presenters.